You've learned a little bit about risk over the last couple chapters, so let's take some time, look at a practice question that could be very similar to something you would see in the actual exam, and pick it apart. Let's go ahead and put the question on the board. Go ahead and pause this video so that you can answer the question yourself. When you're ready, hit play and we'll talk through the answer of this question. All right, hopefully you have your answer in place. Now, the question here is a pretty basic and straightforward question. All of the following are considered non-systematic risks except. Now, this is a very common type of question on a FINRA exam where they set up a scenario or just say, hey, here's a thing. All the following apply to this except. Effectively, we're going to have three non-systematic risks in front of us, which would really leave one risk overall that would be considered a systematic risk. As you have already learned, we put risks basically into two big categories: systematic or non-systematic risk. First, non-systematic risk is any risk that applies to a specific investment, a specific company, or maybe even just a small sector of the market. For example, if you're invested in one specific company and that company is not doing well financially for whatever reason, that is a non-systematic risk applying only to that one company. Versus a systematic risk is a risk that applies to pretty much the broad market or everything across the board. So going into this question, that's the mindset we need to have. Is the risk in front of us a risk that applies to everything or a broad part of the market, being systematic risk, or is it something that applies to a specific company or a specific investment or just a small sector of the market, being a non-systematic risk? Let's go through the answers to see which one is which. With A, we have financial risk. Financial risk is the risk that a company or an organization does something to really set themselves up for failure in regards to their finances. And 9 times out of 10, this usually means that they have borrowed too much money. And whenever a company borrows too much money, it's similar to what would happen if you borrowed too much money. If your credit card bills are too high and your mortgage is too high and you're paying too much in interest every single month to pay back these borrowed funds, eventually you're going to go insolvent or bankrupt. And there will be a day where there's not enough money in your bank account and there's no one else willing to lend money to you, and you'll run into a situation where you wouldn't be able to pay back any of those borrowed funds. And that's a big deal. That can hurt you financially for a number of years. Companies can absolutely do the same thing where they just borrow too much money and they get to a point where they're paying so much interest on the money that they owe back that it really hurts their operations as a company. With that being said, does that sound like a risk that applies to the entire market or a risk that applies to one specific entity, organization, or company? Well, it sounds like it only applies to one specific instance. Companies don't borrow money all at the same time and at the same volume and at the same pace. So this is very much going to be a non-systematic risk that applies to one specific company at a time. Therefore, financial risk is probably not the answer that we're looking for. Going to B, we have market risk. Market risk is the risk that an event or circumstance pushes the value of pretty much the entire market downward. A great example of it is 2008. If you were aware of what was going on, we were going through the worst financial downturn since the Great Depression. At the end of 2008, my investing account was down 47%, and I wasn't the only one. Most of my money was invested in mutual funds. And while you haven't learned a lot about mutual funds yet, mutual funds are big portfolios that typically hold dozens or hundreds of different investments in them. So if you make a purchase of one mutual fund, say a stock mutual fund, you're really investing in hundreds of different companies at a time. That is diversification. And normally diversification is a really good thing, meaning that if there's one stock in my mutual fund that is going down in value, then there's probably dozens of others that are going up in value, balancing out that loss. And that's the great thing about diversification. The problem is, if the entire market is going down because of the greatest financial collapse since the Great Depression, it really doesn't matter how many stocks or investments you have your money in. Every everything is going down across the board, and therefore that is more of a systematic risk that applies to everything. So B is likely our right answer. Something that FINRA tests very heavily on is the fact that you cannot diversify your way out of systematic risk. In my example, I was invested in hundreds of different companies through my mutual funds. At the end of the year, it didn't matter how many different investments I had. I was still down 47% because the entire system or the entire market went down. And that is systematic risk at its core. Although we feel good about B, let's go ahead and talk about C and D before we move on. In C, we have business risk. Business risk is fairly vague and is not terribly specific, but anytime a company is in a situation where they're having trouble selling their products or selling their services, or in plain English, not doing great with their customers, that is business risk. Over the years, many companies have had trouble with business risk. Everything from Radio Shack to Circuit City or any other company that you know that has gone bankrupt because they just were not great at selling their products towards the end of the company's life. Now that's business risk, and to me that sounds like a risk that applies to a specific company or maybe even a small sector of the market, but you really don't need to worry about that applying to the entire system across the board. Therefore, that's definitely a non-systematic risk and not the answer we're looking for on this question. Going to D, we have liquidity risk. Liquidity risk is the risk that you have a really tough time selling the investment you hold. Whether you're talking about a common stock, a preferred stock, bond, whatever, liquidity risk is either the inability to sell the investment because no one wants it, or the fact that you would have to drop the price dramatically in order to sell it. And if you're not doing that, you're just not able to sell the investment. Liquidity risk is something that really affects specific investments at a time. For example, if you own a stock in a company and a bad news article comes out about them and no one wants to buy the stock from you, that's liquidity risk. And liquidity risk hits specific investments at specific points in time. It really doesn't affect the entire market across the board. And because of that, we consider liquidity risk a non-systematic risk. Therefore, D is not the answer they're looking for either. Bottom line, market risk is our only systematic risk up here that affects the entirety of the market across the board. That is, again, a risk that you cannot diversify your way out of, but you could diversify your way out of the other three risks that are up here that are non-systematic. Whether it's financial risk, business risk, or liquidity risk, if you have plenty of different investments in your account, maybe just a few of your investments are facing those risks, but if you have dozens or hundreds of different investments in your account, then diversification will help you mitigate and minimize those risks. So, non-systematic risks can be diversified away by just making sure you don't keep all of your eggs in one basket. Hi, I'm Brandon. If you enjoyed this video, then you'll love the courses I authored with Achievable. They include tons of real-world examples, more videos just like these on dozens of key topics, a built-in study planner, hundreds of chapter review questions, and unlimited practice exams. Our courses are competitively priced, and you can try them out for free first to see if our style is the right fit for you. Follow the links below in the description to get started.